Hey you guys, welcome back once again to Flickers of Fear, my little movie review series. So, not too long before I'm recording this, which, in case you were wondering, is early November of 2022, Shudder actually added a couple of Lucio Fulci's, I guess, less celebrated movies, including Enigma from 1987, Demonia from 1990, and the movie that we're going to be talking about today, which is called Manhattan Baby, and it came out in 1982. Now, this movie was also released under the titles Eye of the Evil Dead and The Possessed. I believe that was the UK title. Now, its original title, like the script's original title, was The Evil Eye, which frankly makes a lot more sense than Manhattan Baby does, but we'll get into that in a minute. Now, I had seen all of these movies, Manhattan Baby, Enigma, and Demonia, at some point, one time or another, but my last viewings of them were at least 20 years ago, probably more, and I couldn't really remember a single thing about any of them. So I kind of got curious, and I was like, well, I'm going to take another gander at these and see what the hell's going on. So I thought I'd start with the earliest one, which, of course, is Manhattan Baby. Now, I'm going to say, watching it again, I could totally understand why Manhattan Baby didn't really stick with me, after seeing it so many years ago. It's definitely not among Fulci's best films, and I'm going to say that later on, both him and the screenwriter, who's Dardano Sacchetti, who he worked with a lot, they didn't totally disown it, but kind of, you know what I mean? Lucio Fulci in particular called it quote unquote terrible, and actually pointed to it as the reason that after this, he never worked again with his, producer that had worked with him on a lot of his films, like Fabrizio De Angelis. He had actually worked with him on Zombie, The Beyond, House by the Cemetery, and New York Ripper, I think. And he's like, after this, it was no more. They didn't work together again after this. Part of the problem, it seemed like, was that the original concept of the film was supposed to be I guess a more big budget, or at least big budget for a Fulci movie, kind of more of a paranormal extravaganza type thing, maybe more along the lines of Poltergeist or something like that. And it was going to have a focus, like I said, more on paranormal or occult themes rather than the gore and, more slasher type stuff that he'd been known for prior. But then maybe because, Fulci's and DeAngelis's previous movie, like the New York Ripper, didn't maybe perform as well as expected, the budget for Manhattan Baby was sliced in half. I believe he was first going to get 800 million lira, and then he only got 400 million lira. I'm not really sure what the exchange rate was back then or what the American equivalent of that would be. But I'm going to say that the lack of funds to realize the vision of the story as it was written is pretty evident as you watch this movie. So, while I don't feel like Manhattan Baby is an awful film, I will admit that it was kind of a slog to sit through. And it's not really even that long. I think it's only an hour and 28 minutes or something like that. It is glacially paced. It borders on narratively incoherent. It doesn't really make a whole hell of a lot of sense. And has a bunch of very strangely lifeless acting performances with only a couple of exceptions. There are some really interesting ideas in here, but a lot of them, not gonna lie, were swiped from other better movies, including some of Fulci's own prior movies. For example, in this movie, we have a mysterious woman who's wearing the same kind of all-white contact lenses as Emily from The Beyond. And Manhattan Baby also uses that exact same, real tinkling, discordant, piano tune that was in The Beyond. It's the exact same piece of music, and it's used here as well. We also have an appearance here from Giovanni Frezza, who, of course, played Bob, the iconic character, in 1981's The House by the Cemetery. Thankfully, he's dubbed by someone else in this, because I kind of feel like that's why everybody remembers him mostly from House by the Cemetery, was that terrible dubbing, but it's somebody else dubs him in this one. And on top of that, this movie also homages lots of other films like Rosemary's Baby, in the fact that it's called Manhattan Baby as an homage to Rosemary's Baby. Also, there's a character in this whose name is Adrian Marcato, which was also a reference to Rosemary's Baby. This also takes some shit from The Exorcist, in that it's focused on a young girl who's possessed by an evil spirit that latched onto her, I guess, after like an archaeological expedition type of thing, like in the desert. And also a pretty blatant homage to The Birds, which occurs in the absolutely batshit, or no, I guess I should probably say bird shit, the bird shit final sequence, which I'll get into a little bit in a minute. Also, because it's kind of focused around Egyptology and specifically on like an evil ancient Egyptian curse of some kind that seemingly possesses the daughter of an archaeologist, you could also say that Manhattan Baby was very heavily influenced by maybe the 1971 Hammer movie, Blood from the Mummy's Tomb, which, matter of fact, was actually in turn loosely based on the 1903 novel by Bram Stoker, which was called The Jewel of Seven Stars. So story-wise in Manhattan Baby, you got the American actor Christopher Connolly, who actually was best known for being on Peyton Place back in the 1960s. He stars as the aforementioned archaeologist, whose name is Professor George Hacker. Now, he's in Egypt working, like, on a working holiday, I guess. And he's accompanied by his wife, Emily, who's played by Laura Lenzi, and their 9-year-old daughter, Susie, who's played by Brigitte Boccoli. Now, their younger son, Tommy, who is, Bob from House by the Cemetery, has actually stayed home back in New York, looked after by the family's au pair, very fancy, Jamie Lee. And Jamie Lee is actually played by Cinzia De Ponte, and she was also in New York Ripper, and she was also in the Lamberto Bava movie, like from 1984, called Monster Shark, which maybe, if you're an MST fan like I am, you probably know better as Devilfish. That's the same movie, and I recognized her immediately from that. So during this expedition, or whatever it is, George, the archaeologist, comes across this unexplored tomb that's kind of rigged with booby traps, like very much like Indiana Jones, like Lara Croft kind of situation, including a pit of spikes that kills one of his colleagues, and some weird blue laser beams that shoot George in the eyes and blind him. Now, while all that is going on, Emily is kind of over here at some other place, like taking photos at another site, and she leaves their daughter Susie alone for a few minutes for whatever reason, at which point this creepy old woman with the completely white eyes, like Emily from the Beyond, gives the little girl an amulet and then mysteriously vanishes. So they go back to New York, and George is understandably like kind of grumpy about this whole loss of vision thing, although the doctor is like pretty sure it's just temporary and you should regain your sight like within the year. But it turns out that he gets it back sooner than that, because there's like another zap from a blue laser beam like in their house somehow, and it restores his vision. So it almost kind of seems as though whatever it was that was in that Egyptian tomb didn't want him to see something that was in there. I mean, that's kind of what I thought. But don't get too excited about this little mystery, because it doesn't really end up factoring into anything like as the story goes forward. And really, at any rate, like the blindness didn't really work as intended, if that's indeed what the intention was, because George actually remembers what he saw in the tomb like well enough to describe it to another friend of his named Weiler. So Emily, meanwhile, the wife, she's also a journalist. Now, she has this insufferable coworker named Luke, who thankfully is only in a couple of scenes. He's actually played by Carlo de Mejo or something, who was in City of the Living Dead and The House by the Cemetery. He's kind of one of those guys, he's always doing like wacky things. Like, look, I'm just sitting at my desk with a Groucho nose on, or, I have those glasses on where the eyeballs come off on springs and stuff like that. I'm so zany, waka waka. It was like that kind of thing. So one day while at work, Emily gets a phone call from the au pair, Jamie Lee, that the kids are locked in their room and she can't get them out. So Emily and Luke go to, Emily's house, like where the kids are. I don't know why she felt the need to take Luke with her, but whatever. So they get there, and Luke, being dorky again, is like, I'm going to open it. I'll show you. Like, the door will open like really, really easily. So he marches up the stairs, and indeed he does open the bedroom door like really easily, but subsequently disappears into some kind of portal, like made up of this blue light. Now, Emily doesn't see this because it happens like up at the top of the stairs. So after a few minutes, she goes up there and she sees the door is open, but she can't find Luke anywhere. She's like, what the fuck? Like, he just disappeared, you know? But basically, she just attributes this vanishing act to his, you know, his ability, like the fact that he does practical jokes all the time. I'm like, okay. And so then he didn't like even show up at work and he just like never came back. So, okay. Yeah, it's a pretty good practical joke, I guess. But we, as the audience, know that he's absolutely not coming back because we see that he's somehow through this portal, like been transported to the Egyptian desert, it looks like, where he has presumably like perished from dehydration. So we don't know how long he's been there. So it turns out, you see, that the amulet that Susie has, that the lady in Egypt gave her, is cursed somehow, like ostensibly by a demon or something named Habnu Menor, I think is how you pronounce it. And this amulet essentially like allows people to travel to another dimension. So Susie and Tommy go on several of these what they call voyages, though these journeys that they're going on are never shown. They basically are just kind of like, oh, we came back. Oh, yeah, we went on a voyage. You know what I mean? But they don't, you know, they didn't have the budget to like show anything. Honestly, it was never really all that clear to me, like whether the kids could go anywhere they wanted or if they always went to the same place, like they went to the ancient Egypt dimension. I kind of suspect that it's the latter because sometimes in the course of the story, it does kind of seem like the ancient Egyptian dimension like overlaps maybe like with this dimension because like for example like on a couple of occasions like the floor on the kid's bedroom is like occasionally covered with sand, and then later on they do like lab analysis of the sand and they're like, hey, this is from the Nile Delta or whatever, but it's never like explicitly stated. So I'm guessing you can just kind of go between these two places. Now at some point the au pair Jamie Lee, she disappears as well, and Tommy tells his parents that she also went on a voyage and hasn't come back yet. Later on, George's colleague, Weiler, the guy he told about the tomb earlier, gets killed in his office by a cobra, so there's that. There's also the very small matter of a Polaroid picture that Jamie Lee took of Susie, the little girl, in Central Park. And initially they think that the film was fucked up or something like that because the picture just comes out completely washed out, like you can't see anything. But then, so they just kind of like chuck it on the ground, which litter bugs, okay. You know, they don't see it, but it later like develops into an image that has like the park normal in the background, but then instead of Susie in the foreground is like the amulet really big. So a woman finds this photo, calls this antique dealer named Adrian Marcato about it, and then writes his name on the back of the picture, and for some reason like puts it in an envelope and then tosses it to Emily like from a balcony, like while Emily is like walking down the street. So then after this, like Susie starts kind of like fainting all the time and like looking kind of ill. There's like more weird blue light kind of anomalous effects and things like that. And even though George and Emily are, you know, pretty skeptical of the paranormal, they eventually track down Adrian Marcato and see if he can give them any information or insight as to like what's going on. So he tells them about this amulet and the evil stone that sort of like resides within it, I guess. And he tells them that their daughter has essentially like absorbed the evil or absorbed this bad energy or whatever. Now, they don't believe him at first, like who would? But then they find the amulet hidden in Susie's desk drawer, like protected by a little black scorpion. And it so happens that the moment that they find it, they get a phone call telling them about Weiler, like his weird death, like how he got killed by a cobra. And that kind of makes them more willing to like accept that there's something supernatural going on, I guess. But they still take Susie to the hospital to get checked out. In another kind of homage to The Exorcist, I guess. Also, one of the doctors is played by Lucio Fulci, because you know how he likes to like turn up in cameos, like in his own movies. So he gets like a couple minutes of screen time where he's just sitting there like baffled and like shaking his head like that, which I thought was really funny. So at the hospital, they find out this little girl's x-rays like show that there's like a shadow of a cobra like inside her body, and I'm just like, okay. Also at one point, they have her in the bed and she's all hooked up to like all these like monitors on her head and whatnot for some reason. And it seems like she kind of dies temporarily, at least judging from the heart monitor, which kind of like flatlines. But like the oddly hilarious thing is that there's no, like, when the girl flatlines, there's no alarm or anything like that, like, to alert hospital staff, like, hey, somebody's dying, you might want to come and, like, try to revive him or whatever. And, like, while all that's going on, like, it flatlines, and her mom is just kind of, like, standing there looking at her blankly and, like, looking at the monitor and looking at her. I'm like, are you gonna call somebody or not? Or it was just, like, very, very weird. I mean, Susie does eventually revive because Marcato is doing some shit, like, in his own place that's kind of, like, sorting everything out, I guess. But the lack of reaction on the part of the mom is, like, really, really bizarre, which I think that's one of the things that I meant when I said the acting performances were kind of, like, lifeless, because she's just, you would think she would be, like, flipping out. I mean, that's her daughter, and it's like, she's dying, oh my god, like, come help me, doctor, nurse, blah, blah, blah. Like, that's what they would usually do in movies, too, but she just kind of stands there and goes, like, looking back and forth, like, looking back and forth from the girl to the fucking monitor. I'm like, it was just so weird. So anyway, like, the reason that Susie comes back, I guess, or is revived, is that Marcato is back in his antique shop, and he's, I guess, like, taken the evil curse onto himself, which thereby, like, frees Susie. I think that's what's going on. Kind of hard to tell. It was just kind of like because the scene, like I said, they didn't have a lot of budget, so it's like they couldn't really show him, like, battling with the demon or anything like that. So basically, it's just like a scene of, like, a close up of his eyes, and, like, he's staring at the amulet, and, like, fucking there's blue light, like, in his face, and he looks all scared, and then, like, it's all over. You know what I mean? But then, so apparently, like, he took the curse onto himself. Hey, I saved your daughter. You know, you're welcome. But then all the stuffed birds in his antique shop all come to life and, like, tippy hedger in his ass, leading to what is easily the best bit of dialogue in the movie. Like, while this is happening, like, he's getting pecked to death by stuffed birds, he says, "You can take my life with stuffed birds, but you shall not have my immortal soul, Habnumenor. Birds of darkness consume me." I just died laughing at that point. This is so funny. I was like, alrighty then. Incidentally, this scene here is pretty much the only scene in the movie that sort of recalls Fulci's, like, older gore classics, you know what I mean, like Zombie and stuff like that. And really, even by his standards, like, it's still pretty restrained. Like, it's not really all that gross. You didn't even get that much eye trauma. It's almost kind of like a little bit of teased eye trauma, because he's like he's kind of pecking around the eyes, but, like, not in the eyes. I don't know if they couldn't afford to, like, do the full splinter in the eyeball, you know what I mean? But they don't do any of that. Really, the only other flash of gore that occurs is when Jamie Lee, who, like I said, went on a voyage and didn't come back, and turns out she was, like, behind the wall somehow, but her kind of, like, grody zombified arm, like, pops out from a hole in the wall, and that's with, you know, some kind of crap all over it, but that's, like, about it, like, as far as gore goes. So George, the archaeologist, upon Marcato's advice, we obviously gave him advice before he died, because he does die, he basically, like, takes the amulet and chucks it in the East River, but which supposedly, like, gets rid of the curse. But then there's, like, this little brief epilogue, and we see, like, that white-eyed lady, like, back in Egypt, like, giving the same amulet, or what appears to be the same amulet, to another little girl. So the curse continues, I guess. I mean, it's never really explained, like, who this woman is, why she's specifically targeting young girls, like, to give this amulet to, like, what is Habnumenor, like, is he a demon? What's his ultimate goal? I mean, if his ultimate goal is world domination, I mean, it's gonna take a while if he just keeps targeting one kid at a time with these mystical dimension hopping amulets that he has. But, you know, I don't know. I'm not a demon, so I don't really know. Maybe he's a slow and steady wins the race kind of guy. I'm not gonna, like, you know, get all up in his shit about it, because he knows what he's doing, clearly. So anyway, like I said, I mean, this isn't a great film by any means. I know that it has its defenders. Some people really do like the kind of borderline surrealistic tone to it, and I guess, like, Fulci's willingness to try something conceptually different from what he'd done before. And honestly, like, this movie almost seems like this kind of, like, heralded the more sci-fi and fantasy-based direction that he kind of explored in some of his later work. He did do, like, more slashers and stuff like that, like, later on, like, as the 80s progressed, but he did do a lot of more sci-fi sword and sandal type stuff, like, in the 80s, and this is kind of like the first little hint of that, I guess. Now, I do like the idea of weaving kind of an Egyptian curse narrative and a parapsychological kind of angle, like, into a story which is set in modern day New York, but, you know, the low budget and, you know, really, really didn't help. And also, the lack of a cohesively explained mythology, I kind of feel like that really shot this one in the dick, because, you know, it's one thing if you're writing a story where you have like a supernatural force or a supernatural demon or something like that, it has to have rules. You have to know what it can do, what it can't do, like what are its weaknesses, what are its powers and stuff like that. And it seems like that was never really established with any certainty. So it almost seemed like, I don't know, it just seemed kind of half-assed, because I was just like, well, what is the end goal? Like, what is the end game, like, for this demon or whatever it is? Like, why are we targeting these specific people? Like, what, you know what I mean? What is the outcome supposed to be? And like, you didn't really know like exactly what the parameters like of the powers were, and like the going between dimensions, or why it had that or anything like that. So it just seemed like they didn't really like think through, you know, kind of a structure around like the paranormal thing that they had happening, which you do have to do, maybe even more than if you're doing something like realistic, because everybody has to understand, because this is a supernatural thing or a thing that doesn't exist, you have to like make it pretty clear like what the rules are, and then you have to adhere to those. And I feel like the movie didn't really do that. Now, if you're really into Lucio Fulci's movies and you haven't seen this one for whatever reason, I'd recommend that you watch it just like for completion's sake. But anybody like not familiar with his work would probably just be completely baffled and or completely bored by it, so I wouldn't recommend it. And even for Fulci fans, this is usually like ranks among his lowest. Like I said, it's not terrible, but it's not really all that great. I didn't find it like laughably bad, but it is like, it was real slow, and it was just kind of real hard to sit through, because it just like wasn't clear exactly like what was going on all the time. And you could tell that they had like a much bigger idea that really had to be hemmed in by, you know, them losing like half of the budget. So maybe if this had had the original budget, it would have like made more sense, and they could have like put more stuff in it. But you know, as it was, this was the movie that we got. And like I said, Fulci didn't really like it and disowned it a little bit later on. So let me know if you have seen this movie, and if you did, what you thought about it in the comments. And that will do it for this Flickers of Fear. I'll see you guys again on the next one. Bye.